Dr. Patrick Alcedo.
Good afternoon, almost good evening. But before anything else, I would like to acknowledge that this project would not have been possible if not for my cinematographer and my collaborator, Fruto Cores, so I would just like to really acknowledge him. And then in 2009, when we did much of this filming, my partner, Erwel Francisco, helped us a lot, so he's here in the room. When I was doing my work on the Atihan Festival as a dance anthropologist, as a graduate student, the work in dance studies at that time was very much into writing, and I thought that this filming was a way for me to partner my writing. And later on, I realized that, and of course, visual anthropology really came into prominence in the 1980s, and I realized that in dance, it's even more important that I really create a multi-platform scholarship. And here I'm wearing different hats where I also do filming and at the same time writing scholarly exegesis. For tonight, please allow me to read a little bit of what I wrote. Actually, it's a little bit longer. I got overexcited because of the book project, so I wrote too long. But here I shortened it, and I hope that this will be a kernel for the fabulous project that Robert is going to do for all of us. My paper this afternoon is entitled "Dancing Queer to be Intimate with the Roman Catholic Church." It builds on my earlier article, Sacred Camp, Transgendering Faith in the Philippine Festival, that argues that first, the paradoxes in the performance of Panaad, or devotional promise, Sacred Camp, and Carnivalesque provided Augusto Johnson ways in which to claim membership in the Roman Catholic community of Calibo, Aklan, Central Philippines, while also negotiating the Church's institution of heterosexuality. In addition, the article maintains that the stories of mischief about the exploits of the Santo Niño, the Holy Child Jesus, outside the cathedral, for example, of him leaving the altar at night to play with kids in the plaza or the town square, and his gender ambiguity as a prepubescent boy, further allowed Augusto to dance as a fully bergère chorus girl during the annual Atihan Festival. Augusto, my former ballet teacher in Calibo, identified himself in his native Aklanon language as an agi, a man of the third sex, as he further self-identified in English. As a self-identified gay individual myself, I've always had a sense of intimacy with Augusto, who I fondly called Tay Agus, or Daddy Ogie, Daddy Agus. As I had explained elsewhere, to be called a bakla, a Tagalog word, in Aklan could be derogatory, as its semantics is not as fluid as the Aklanon agi. Agi encompasses the gamut of being gay, homosexual, queer, third sex, for its semantics is playful. Agi, therefore, acts like a floating signifier and embodies campiness, as in, and here I'm going to do a little bit of acting, as in the Aklanon banter, nag-inagi kagunman. Okay? There you are, agiing again. It is in the fluidity of agi that Augusto decided to navigate both his quotidian and festival lives. In my presentation today, which is intended, as I said, which is intended to be a part of Robert's project and hopefully also a book chapter in my own, I focus on Augusto's actual dancing, that moment when he went out of his house to dance in the streets of Calibo in drag. Such travesty, ubiquitous in the Atihan, of priests in mufti, of newlywed men dancing as pregnant women, of men and women in mumu-like garbs, to blur gender identities and others, I understand through the optic of the Carnivalesque. When I asked Augusto a year later what drew him to the fully bergère chorus girl and why of all the possibilities of mimicry, he chose to embody that image for his panaad, he said, and in Aklanon, dahil manami gid ang mayad andang costume, ag andang choreography ag saot. Because their costumes were extremely beautiful and their choreography and dance were so well put together, unquote. Augusto fondly recalled the first fully bergère performance, a group of high-kicking, Caucasian-looking women in stiletto he saw in the 1970s in Manila at the Cultural Center of the Philippines, which was built by Imelda Marcos to announce that the Philippines was capable of providing a nurturing and appreciative oasis for world-class performances. But it was the Ice Foolies, a cast of international figure skating champions that left a deeper impression on him. This group corporalized for Augusto the foreign image and the kind of dancing body he was imitating from the magazine his niece sent him from Chicago almost a decade earlier. Their performance embodied the extravaganza he wanted sewn into his panaad. It would deepen the rest of his Santo Niño devotion and continually change in an excessive fashion the face of that Atihan festival. Augusto saw these Caucasian-looking figure skaters at the Araneta Coliseum, which in the early 1960s was considered to be the world's biggest covered coliseum. This performance space has always been the venue for Binibining Pilipinas, which, by the way, MJ Lastimosa is really doing well, and I can't sleep. Yay, top 5, they said. The Miss Philippines beauty pageant, I can't help. I'm a big fan of, how can I not help it? The grand prize winner of which represents the Philippines is in Miss Universe, and actually they did again at the Araneta, and the first runner-up in Miss World. In 1975, it gained additional international visibility when it hosted the unforgettable Thrilla in Manila. The still much talked about event in the boxing world pitted Muhammad Ali and Fraser against each other, and Joe Fraser. Augusto clearly remembered the teams of white, lithe bodies, dancing mostly to adagio music, that were floating on the immense oval rink to please the Filipino public. He was in awe to find the Coliseum in a tropical country, right in the middle of the urban center of Cubao, and a known space for other events, such as high-priced gambling and cockfighting derby. Suddenly had his performance space filled with ice. Just like Ali and Fraser, who neither were the same after that unforgettable match, Augusto left that Coliseum no longer the same person. He was firmer in his resolve to stay as a Folie Bergère chorus girl throughout his Atihan life. And here I'm gonna skip a few pages. This is my overexcitement pages. These are my In the street dancing that was synonymous to a carnival event, its time accented and atmosphere intensified to the extreme, Augusto found his ultimate expression of faith. Through his excessive quote-unquote female body, he danced the panaad, or devotional promise, he had been observing for decades. He paraded his Folie Bergère chorus body and imbued it internally with sacrality and unknowingly made it ooze with campiness against the background of the carnival. He danced this double corporeality, which was still recognizably Augusto, and always took on a foreign self with face sensibility. The carnival offered Augusto a non-quotidian frame in which to transgender his faith to temporarily become, quote-unquote, a woman, so as to announce his being an agi and to provide some laughter to the Santo Niño and his many faithfuls. While it opened the floodgates of inebriation, excess, and transvestism, the carnival set in motion the two webs of meaning of panaad and sacred camp, which is in my earlier article. It was the carnivalesque frame in the Atihan, the third web of meaning, this is what I call in this chapter that I'm developing, that in the end allowed Augusto's female body, which she took the trouble to make up and dress up, kneel in one of the pews of the Calibo Cathedral to be left alone by him or by herself to be momentarily lost in prayer. And this is the last section. In response to why his transgendering should not be seen as sacrilegious, Augusto would say, "Ginasugtan man ni Monsignor para magkasadya kita." It is allowed by Monsignor so that we all can have fun at this time of the year. He danced away with his permission as far as he could into the land of his fantasy in order to embody a female self he could only prepare for and dream of in the everyday. In this imaginary universe, Augusto corporalized what the public appreciated. Year after year, he transgendered himself and convinced the Santo Niño that the doors of the Calibo Cathedral should be kept wide open for him. Augusto pushed the boundaries of Calibo's Roman Catholicism, demonstrating how tolerant it could be in its accommodation of each and everyone's excesses, how soft towards class and gender differences, and how accepting of fantasies adherents wished to experience at the moment. His 80-year-old self carried his costume with the panache of a young ballerina and conviction of a devout Catholic from morning and well into the night. He rhythmically defined his performance with a cacophony of music that was both anachronistic and contemporary. Happy Days Are Here Again from the country's colonial past was no longer a song about the U.S. Great Depression of the 1930s and 1940s, but newfangled to become a melody of fun and laughter for the Kalibunons. Augusto climaxed his street dancing with his favorite Latin music for that year, Mambo No. 5, created by Lou Bega, an artist born in Germany who has a Ugandan father and Italian mother. On the asphalt streets, he fitted his moves to this music Bega originally composed for salsa. And here I wear my dancer's hat. Dancing, his marrying cha-cha-cha with Bega's salsa music was so infectious that the crowd did not mind the disparity, a mismatch which in the ballroom dancing floor would have been automatically judged as non sequitur. Augusto stepped forward with his left foot, did a right shoulder half turn with his right foot, and on the next count and finished with a paddy beret to the back. His high-heeled shoes elevated his dancing body and made his turns, which were as smooth as the countless soutenu, chanés, and pirouettes I remembered as him dancing during our ballet classes, all the more challenging. Even though he had to hold his torso straight to keep erect the towering headdress, he still found the freedom to oppose continuously his arms with his busy feet, to snap intermittently his bejeweled fingers, and to sway demurely his feather boa-covered hips. He repeated these steps until the music faded out to segue into another music of his choice. In conclusion, every time Augusto covered his face with makeup and slipped on the different parts of his costume, he departed from his quotidian self and entered into a new carnivalesque self. After partaking in a sumptuous meal, when the last of his guests had left his home that night, Augusto called his help Ambo to help him find the tens of hairpins stuck around his headdress, and to unhook his feather boa tutu and beaded bustier. Augusto reminded Ambo to hook carefully his headdress and the soft tattoo on the nail just above the many images of the crucified Christ, and to store the bustier back to the carnation milk box under his bed below the Santo Niño statuettes. Ambo then left the room quickly. I followed him to leave Augusto alone to take off his wig, to slip off his spandex thong and pantyhose, to stack his jewels inside the case, and to smear his face with Pond's cold cream, to erase his thick Japanese-made Kokuryo and US-made Max Factor makeup. When his servants were about to turn off the lights, I left Augusto to retire in his yellow-walled bedroom with his many figures of the smiling Santo Niño, the crucified Jesus Christ, and the beneficent Virgin Mary. It was in that room, littered with the many parts of his costume, hooked and tucked away in several corners, in the sacred presence of those devotional figures, where Augusto ended his outpouring of feminine and exaggerated energy that left him spent corporeally, but overjoyed spiritually. What Augusto additionally made more tangible was how attentive, or following the parlance of Philippine studies scholar Sally Ann Ness, how resilient cultural bearers could be in their ability to take on different bodies in response to competing historical and religious forces that infiltrate their ordinary and extraordinary festival lives. It was the resiliency that ultimately made his undulation to the musics so infectious, and his iridescence against the bamboo sulu torches and under the cathedral's yellow lights difficult to eclipse and still. Indeed, as Martin Melanson theorizes, and paraphrasing him, Augusto played with the world and authored himself to make sense of his sexuality and of his Roman Catholic upbringing. In the floating signifiers that comprised the Atihan festival, Augusto wended his transgendered body to produce a sea of signifieds. His faith in the Santo Niño and the mischief and gender ambiguity of the Holy Child Jesus serve as Augusto's rudder, keeping him, his Agi identity, and his fiercely fabulous choreography on a steady dancing keel. Thank you.
And I loved your essay on Augusto, which was probably one of my favorite people that was showcased in the film.
Thank you.
I actually have two very awkward questions.
Sure.
So I guess the first question, because it's very personal to me, is my curiosity at your use of the term transgender, both as a verb and as an adjective. And so I'm just curious about it because it is a very Western term with a very specific meaning, and the use seems to be placed on a very non-Western aklanon agi, which is a very different understanding than what I have as a transgender person to be like, my identity does not match what I was assigned. This is who I am. This is not something that I wear as a costume. This is, it was a very important process for me as a person. Yeah. So I'm interested about how you use that both as like a verb and an adjective in the essay, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I think that will always be a dilemma of writing in English, and I think there will always be never a one-to-one correspondence, and I think you just have to accept that fact, and that's the reason why I really advocate for multi-platform scholarship, because I think there's no one platform that can really, at least this is what I argue, that can really capture, and I think you could never do that in a discourse, the complexities of any knowledge formation. So that's my take on it. And I think my idea of transgendering, and I think in the written form, your experience of writing, when you have all the footnotes and when you have the endnotes and all of that, and the multi-layeredness of the parenthetical exegesis, I think will be a different experience. But I think when I use the transgender, I think I really mean it to be inversive. And I know that it takes on a very specific Western term here, but I think I also trouble that. It also trouble that, and sometimes my troubling of that would be to use transgender, third sex, agi, bakla, and all of that. And I think as an ethnographer, I want to demonstrate that multiplicity of languages, which is really true in that locality. They have this cacophony of languages, and I think that's what I'm struggling with, and that's why while I'm doing that platform, I'm also performing, I'm also writing in different venues to capture that. Yeah.
And I think my second question. Sorry, Robert. Okay, really quickly. Yeah.
David, you have a question?
It really impressed upon me both the different layers of, say, like the heteropatriarchal queer analysis that was happening there, as well as the racial analysis. I want to know what's your thoughts on that, if you have like a different essay, because the essay that you read very much focused on Augusto, but I was very focused on the dynamics between the Ati people and the other Klanons and their use of blackface, which then creates this power dynamic where they find something that they want to imitate without actually I guess, acknowledging until maybe later when they had the schools for the Ati people, the class disparity, which I find fascinating because it's different with Augusto, who was moving up, I guess, with his homage to Santo Nino and to the women dancers, which is a lot different than the people that are actually in your community that you place soot on your face to imitate. Do you know what I mean? So.
Yeah. I was very fortunate. Just a few months ago, my article, How Black is Black, the Atis Compete at the Philippine Festival, came out. Palgrave Macmillan, Dance Ethnography, Politics of Embodiment. I can give you the citation. In that article, it's really predicated very much on Spivak's strategic essentialism. And here I also question my positionality as a non-Ati, as a conduit through which to problematize their position in society. But also I've been struggling because I must say that I'm a middle class, not really an upper middle class like Cecile, for example, but somebody who is definitely not marginalized. And even given my transnational diasporic status, I mean, it really changed the socioeconomic dynamics that I have in the community. But in that article, I do problematize. But and I really question, for example, issues around authenticity and issues around competition, which is very much, which fuels this festival. And in fact, during my sabbatical last year, I decided to adjudicate this festival and to really put on an activist hat and to tell the organizers that they should change, that they should not really, that they should problematize the indigenous category. And I think what they're doing now, moving forward, is that the artists actually will start the festival and will no longer be part of the competition. So I think there's hope. Yeah.
David, thank you. Okay, I hate microphones.
So thank you. And there's so much that we don't know about Augusto, right? And
Yeah.
that we want to know, and we've kind of just been
Yeah.
shown a little vignette, a little glimpse. It looks like Augusto performs this gender transgression once a year. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's kind of what I took from this. And so given that context that I'm reading into it, and I could be wrong, I'm wondering if this performance, the permissibility of this performance, could be the church or religion's effort to contain this gender transgression to this one moment, and how is that informing the lives of others who it isn't a moment of performance, but like was just kind of iterated earlier.
Very good.
Just
Yeah, I think that's also my critique of like a very Bakhtinian kind of analysis where, you know, you only are allowed, for example, an extraordinary moment in order to have these permissive behaviors that are actually outside the normative. But I think it's a much more complex understanding. And when you look at the life of Tagus, he's actually in the everyday life. He was actually, and here I'm not be so articulate, but he's really friends with the Archbishop, for example. He went to Jerusalem with the Archbishop. But he, obviously, outside the festival, he cannot be in a fully bergère, chorus girl, and be transgendered inside the church. But I must say, and this is open for argument, is that in that part of the country, I must say that there's this kind of permissiveness that is, the Catholicism there really took on a kind of folk Catholicism, where there is that kind of opening for gender ambiguity. But the idea of resistance is not so apparent, where you don't actually say that we are gays and that we oppose this. But I think the acceptance is almost implicit, which again could be read here in the Western world as something that is non-resistance. But this is where my discourse is trying to do, and which is what I'm trying to do in my book project, is to really nuance this kind of folk Catholicism and these understandings of outing, if you will, and the relationship with the church, because he's a very, very faithful Catholic. But at the same time, his faithfulness is very much predicated on Santo Niño, who is very playful and mischief. Because the Santo Niño in that part of the world is most likely a very different Santo Niño from other parts of the world. And I think that's what I'm trying to nuance and be very specific, is that they take on local, specified practices. And I think that's very important in knowledge production. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe we've answered most of Roland's call. I mean, we talked about religiosity, right? Which is what you believe. So I'm just going to flag that. And so I think we're kind of, doing a good job here, I think, of dealing with the kind of questions that we are challenged with in the beginning. And so now we're going to go to, I am going to be in a panel with JP and Marissa. I will shorten my discussion so that we're in time. So I'm basically going to do a speed talk of what I thought was going to be my presentation. So, I mean, and just follow the visuals, and then, like follow the dancing ball of visuals around queer pageant.